welcome to another episode of Drilling Deeper, our YouTube channel here from the Oil Museum of Canada. Today we're going to look at the history of Petrolia and the early years of this frontier town. General myth has that Petrolia was this elegant Victorian oil town. Well, here I'm going to destroy that image. Petrolia in its early years is everything but that classical Victorian oil town. It was a boom town, a shanty town of workers that was hastily built to support industry and didn't become that classical, well-to-do town that we see today until the latter part of the 1800s and early 1900s. In reality, Petrolia is more of an Edwardian town that we see today. During the early years, 1866, it started the boom with Captain Bernard King drilling his gusher off of what today is called Eureka Street. His gusher gushed 800 barrels of oil in a day, shooting up out of the ground and covering the landscape in oil. This is the start of what became Petrolia. People migrated from oil springs hoping to make their fortunes in the newly opened up oil fields around a muddy creek called Bear Creek. Consequently, Bear Creek got its name because there were bears playing in it. This creek was where people set up their businesses along the shores and the banks of it. But Petrolia itself is located in an unlikely area for settlement. It's located in the middle of the Great Enniskillen Swamp, thick clay soils that hold onto moisture. People hastily built buildings that looked more like barns than they did actual places of residence. It was made out of clapboard and wooden planks and quickly put up for the purpose of shelter and not for general aesthetics or beauty. We can look at many of these images from the historical record, and we can see going through the center of town is a massive ditch. This ditch was really important. This was a drainage ditch. We needed to have this drainage ditch going through the center of town to keep the roads dry and to prevent the buildings from flooding and washing away. But people at that period of time also used this ditch to dispose of their waste. Chamber pots were dumped into it, horse manure was emptied into it, and the refuse from the drilling and petroleum industry was thrown in there as well. Could you imagine? It is a creek full of dirty, oily, poopy water. There were duck boards or planks going across the ditch so you could go from one side of the street to the other. We even have quotes from the newspaper, the Globe and Mail, from the 1880s. And I'll read a couple of those quotes for you to give you an outsider's perspective of what Petrolia looked like. The streets are of blue clay, and in dry weather, beds of dust. In the spring and fall, they are perfect quagmires. Countless loads of gravel have been deposited onto these roadways, only to disappear as completely as salt thrown into a pot of boiling porridge. So this tells us no matter what people were doing at this period of time, without adequate drainage, this area was unpleasant and muddy. In fact, you had boardwalks going around to keep your feet dirty because otherwise you'd get stuck in the mud. And in that same article from the Globe and Mail, further down, it says the gas is everywhere present. In damp weather, it penetrates the bedrooms and renders sleep a difficult thing for persons of sensitive olfactories. The buildings become discolored, for nothing but zinc paint will resist the peculiar influence of the gas. Silverware turns black, and even the walls and ceilings of the houses show the penetrating atmosphere of the place. Yet residents have become so habituated as to suffer little or no inconvenience. This tells us that people coming from outside are shocked by the conditions, but over time you get used to it. Many of the people coming into Petrolia were from Toronto or other bigger cities, and in particular for this report, it is a Toronto reporter. So maybe not so used to frontier life, but at the same time, we can't ignore the fact Petrolia smelled and it was dirty, and people were more focused on business and extracting oil from the ground than they were about the aesthetics or pleasantries of the community. Now, if we look for some internal residents, we can see that we have a quote from a little boy that was living in Petrolia, and he wrote in his schoolwork. So this is John Ipster's school report from 1884 about his community. He said, "It has no buildings of any importance, they being mostly part wood. It also has a very bad smell, and visitors coming in are shocked by the smell from the refineries, the acid works, and the wells. And a small, dirty, oily creek called Bear Creek runs through it." So that tells you even the residents of Petrolia were not impressed by their town. It wasn't until the 1890s, after several votes and a push from the community, that we start getting community buildings being built. First, it was the Victoria Hall. And then only after several complaints and two little girls passing out near an outhouse due to the sewer gases, do we finally have a push within the community to build sewer works and waterworks. In fact, at this period of time, waterworks such as piped water from Lake Huron was considered a luxury and a convenience for households, not a vital necessity to have clean water for drinking. So this tells us a lot more about this town and shows that for its first 40 years of existence, Petrolia is more of a shanty boom industrial town, a rough and tumble frontier town, than it is the Victorian town we see today. In fact, Petrolia is more likely an Edwardian town when those grand buildings were built in the late 18 and early 1900s. So now we know a little bit more about the history, which is equally as fascinating, if not more interesting, about the early origins of our favorite Petrolia. We hope to see you again on Drilling Deeper here at the Oil Museum of Canada.